I'll do it. I'll be there Monday morning at 10 o'clock.
Wednesday.
Wednesday,
Sorry,
Jeff.
Wednesday morning at 10 o'clock.
Benjamin Herschel.
Hi, Herschel.
Hi, how are you? I'm glad to see you too.
Nice to see you.
It's nice to meet you and meet your mom.
Yeah.
I miss you, Shul. I miss you.
I know, I miss you too.
Maybe next year, by sometime next year, we'll be back together in Shul. I hope so. Right?
Correct. I will.
And I'll give you a hug. Right?
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, if I can ask you to give your attention to Rabbi Yasker, who's going to also introduce our guest scholar, Professor Price, this afternoon, and ask you again to please make sure that you mute yourselves. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Rabbi Greed. I wanted to begin first again giving a share kochech to Professor Price for last night's presentation. Very well attended and very much appreciated. Thank you, Dr. Price. Today's shir, as last night's, is sponsored by Cheryl Scher in the memory of loved ones very special to her, in memory of her husband Charles, Yecheskel ben Yosef, her grandmother Helen Margolis, Rivka bat Abraham, and her grandfather Barnett Margolis, Baruch ben Yitzchak. And the Shamas continue to have an aliyah, and may their family members continue to bring goodness and spirituality into this world. I have a question to share with you on the structure of our Parsha this week of Vayechi. Often when we talk about structure, we may be tying it into elements of the story and how they were arranged. But here it's a very physical question. Normally, between one Parsha to another, we have space, minimally 9 letters worth of blank space, and sometimes a totally new paragraph. And yet, in this week's Parsha, there is no space between last week's end and this week's beginning. It's just like another verse going on. And Rashi comments that that's sharing the words of the Medrash, that the reason that the Parsha is closed, no space, it continues to be a very closed Parsha, is because when Yaakov died, which he'll die in this Parsha, when Yaakov died, that our eyes and our hearts were closed from the troubles of the shibud, of the enslavement. But many raised the question, how could we say that? We have another very strong tradition that as long as any one of Yaakov's sons were alive, as long as those heads of the tribes were alive, that there was no enslavement. So that appears to be contradictory. The Sfas Emes answers that, saying that that is true about physical enslavement. As long as any one of Yaakov's sons were alive, there was no physical enslavement. But spiritual enslavement, that was another consideration. And that unfortunately, once Yaakov was off the scene, that there were elements of assimilation that started, that the Egyptian culture started to make its impact upon our ancestors. We who are gathered online today are among those, Baruch Hashem, a very growing amount of people committed, no matter where we are, when we are, we're committed that our own personal culture is built on Torah, the study of Torah, the implementation of Torah and Torah principles. And I want to thank Cheryl Scher for enabling us to increase the opportunities that we give to our membership, plus whoever else is tuning in, to learn Torah and to find messages so relevant for our lives. So thank you, Cheryl. And again, thank you, Dr. Nechama Price, for being with us today.
Am I up? Okay. Hi, everybody. How are you? I am going to, first of all, I'm going to put it one more time in the chat if anybody wants the source sheet, but I will try to share screen. I don't think anyone is the host right now. So hopefully it works. Did that work? Yes?
Yes.
Beautiful. Okay. All right. If there's any issues with the shared screen, please notify me immediately. I would appreciate that. Okay, so today's topic, last night we discussed lying, and today we are discussing what I would say is a fundamental topic of the parshiot that we are learning, which is, of course, favoritism. I think all of us that are here, we would all say with complete belief, we don't favor one child over another. We certainly don't favor one grandchild over another. If I give $1 to one, or now maybe it's $5 or $10, I will give the same amount to all, right? We believe this. We don't favor our children. But it's interesting because I've done this with my students and I ask them, and my own children even, a little embarrassed to say, but it's true. I've asked them, you know, do you think that I favor, or do you think that your parents favor one child over another? And the reality is that most kids will say yes. They will say that certainly they do see that their parents favor one over the other. And therefore, if this is true, everybody sees my screen? I'm moving it a little bit. I just want to make sure it's moving for all of you. Here, I'll move it. Is it moving?
No.
No.
It's not moving.
No.
Hold on. Is it moving now? I just want to make sure I did it right.
No.
No.
Unshare and reshare. Oh, my sharing screen has paused. Hold on. We're going to play with this one more time before I start the sources. Now, is it moving?
Yeah.
Okay, fabulous. Somehow I paused.
Yes, it's moving.
I'm not moving it now. Now it's moving. Yes, we're good. I'm moving it up and down. Yes?
Right.
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Okay, everybody back on mute. So it happens to be that most of the time, as I was just saying, we believe that there is favoritism. Our children perceive favoritism. And therefore, it's something to think about, you know, what do we do with this idea of favoritism, especially based on the fact that if I said to you, what is the theme of the last number of Parshiot, and maybe a theme that you see throughout all of Sefer Breshit, you would say to me, it's a theme of favoritism. There is so much favoritism that goes on in all the stories of the Avot. And therefore, what I want to start with is the most obvious story of favoritism, which is that of Yaakov and Yosef. And then we're going to move throughout all of Tanakh, including this coming week's Parsha, to all different stories of favoritism to see what we can understand about the concept of favoritism. You know, especially when it comes to Yaakov, when it has to do with Yosef. I think sometimes when we read Sefer, or I would even say Parshas Vayeshev, we want to yell at Yaakov. You know, we want to say, what are you doing? You know, didn't you realize that if you favored one kid over the other, so obviously it's going to make problems within your house? Don't you realize that you were setting him up for something terrible? And I think from some perspective, we have to take a step back and realize that it's very obvious from our perspective. We're reading the Chumash, we're reading the story, and it seems very clear to us what's going on. But as a person within the story, it's not always as obvious as it looks to the outside reader of the story itself. I'll give you another example. If you ever read the book of Judges, right, Sefer Shoftim, and you see in the book of Judges a cycle, right? We worship Avodah Zarah, God gets mad at us, gives us over to an enemy, we then cry out, he then sends a shofet and he saves us. But then sadly, years later, we start sinning again, we worship Avodah Zarah, and the cycle starts again. And sometimes you look at the book of Judges and you say, what's your problem, Jewish people? Just stop serving Avodah Zarah and you would stop having all these problems. It's so obvious. But then you realize that that's obvious to me because I'm the reader and I see it so clearly within the text of the story. But if I live during the time of Judges, which is a period of over 300 years, it's not that this is exactly what took place as a punishment for the fact that I served Avodah Zarah. So sometimes being within the story itself, things are not as obvious. But let's look at the first story of Yaakov and his favoritism towards Yosef. We'll return to Yaakov when we're discussing with Binyamin and Ephraim and Menashe from this week's Parsha. But I want to start with the story of Yaakov and Yosef to kind of give us the ideas of what we're going to see throughout all of the stories of Breshit. If I start in source number 1, which should now be in front of you, which is the very beginning of the Yaakov Yosef story, the first 4 words are pretty striking. Eila toldos Yaakov, Yosef. These are the generations of Yaakov, Yosef. Why is that so striking? Because if you look at the words Eila toldo, these are the generations of, throughout Tanakh. Here, I gave you a few as an example, like here in source 2, Eila toldos Noach. We hear a little bit about Noah, but then we hear he had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Yafet. Or I'll give you another example here, source 3. Eila toldos Noach, meaning the Bnei Noach, the children of Noach, Shem, Ham, and Yafet. And then we have an entire chapter listing the children of Shem, listing the children of Ham, and listing the children of Yafet. Or one more, Eila toldos Terach, and then we hear about Avram, Nahor, and Haran, 3 sons. So when I go back to Eila toldos Yaakov, and it only says Yosef, it's a little strange. It's like the Torah is already trying to tell me something is different between Yosef and the rest of his brothers. Now the Kli Yakar points this out off right here in source number 5. Eila toldos Yaakov Yosef. Why? Shehu ikar toldot shalo, because he was the most important to Yaakov. He was the one that Yaakov said, this is my guy, this is my favorite, and therefore it's Eila toldos Yaakov Yosef. But even if I don't want to learn it from the first 4 words, perhaps I can learn it from, I'm going to go back up, right? I can learn it from the next pasuk. V'Yisrael ahavet Yosef mikol banav. Okay, there it's obvious. Yaakov loved Yosef more than all of his other sons. So if I didn't learn it out from these words, I can't deny the beginning of pasuk Gimel. Not only that, I'm going to come back to these words. Ki ben zukinim hilo, he was the man of his child of his old age. We'll come back to that. Vasalu ketonet pasim. We have what I would say is probably one of the biggest no-nos in parenting. When you give a really fancy, nice present to one child, I guess when it's not his birthday, and you don't give to the rest of your children. Yaakov gives Yosef something that is very, very symbolic. He gives him a ketonet pasim, some sort of very bright, colorful stripe type of garment that he would wear to symbolize something very important. There's one other story where we have a ketonet pasim to try to understand what this coat really represents. And this is a story in Shmuel Bet of the daughter of David HaMelech. Her name was Tamar, and she wore this ketonet pasim. It's the only other place in Tanakh that we have a ketonet pasim. And the pasuk tells us it was a coat that showed her status. It was something that benot hamelech habetulot me'ilim. It was a type of coat you would wear, a special coat that symbolized you were a princess, you were a virgin princess. It's a coat of status. It's to show your stature. So too we have in Tanakh Shaul, who was the king, who wore a coat, which is why David was able to rip that coat in the cave. And Yonatan, who had a coat, Asher Alav, that was on him. Yonatan, the prince, but not just the prince that was the heir to the throne. Wearing some sort of coat or giving your child this type of coat is certainly very symbolic. It's saying something. It's not just saying, oh, you're cold, let me buy you a coat. It's saying something much more significant. This is picked up on source number 9 by Rav Mecklenburg. Why did he give him this coat? It was a sign. You're in charge. You're the leader in this home. You're the leader in the house. You're the leader in the field. And the Haktav HaKabbalah goes on of Mecklenburg. How you dressed showed your value, showed your status, which is why later Paro gives him a new set of clothes when he becomes second to king, because how you're dressed showed the significance of who you were. And therefore Yaakov, by giving him specifically the gift, even though of course it's a gift he gave him, but not to anyone else, is symbolic enough. But giving him a gift of this sort, a coat, for him to wear something that shows his significance, but not just as I love you, but more of a significance of you're important, you're the leader, you're going to be in charge. However, it also reminded me of one other story of a parent giving specifically a coat to a child. And it's something that I think is very emotional and something that really, brings us to understand this very close relationship between Yaakov and Yosef, which is the story here in source 10. You see, Hannah, made a coat for her son Shmuel. What's the story? What's the background to this coat? Well, as we all know, Shmuel Hanavi is born to Hannah after many, many years of infertility, and she wanted a child so badly. And at some point, she goes to Shiloh and she's davening to Hashem. That's the famous story where she's davening quietly, and Eli thinks she's drunk, and we learn out tefillah from her. And she promises God that if you give me a child, I will give him back to you. He will work in the Mishkan with Eli. I will give him back. And then, of course, when he's born, she has to give him back. And you see, she's sad in the story. She doesn't want to go in the beginning. You know, she waits till he's weaned. And then what you hear is the story. Again, an echo, if everyone could go on mute, where she comes to visit him every single year. And when she visits him every single year, she brings him a coat. And you feel in her this sadness of how much she misses her child. She probably sits there all year making him this coat because he grew another inch. He needs a new coat, right? It's somebody else is raising him instead of her. And therefore she goes and she delivers this coat to him. To me, I feel the same with Yaakov. There's deep emotion that he has for Yosef as he hands over this coat to Yosef. So here we have Yaakov from the beginning treating Yosef very differently, right? Elah told us Yaakov, Yosef, he loves him more than the rest. He gives him something special. We also see that he doesn't seem to work to the same extent as his brothers, right? We see to the extent that number one, he's with his dad on the day that his dad sends him to go check on his brothers in the field. Sounds like he has a different role. The brothers go out to shepherd. He gets to stay behind. Not only that, the part of the pasuk I mentioned before, ki ben zikunim, back to pasuk Aleph, Ramban points out, what does that mean? He was the son of his old age. He wasn't the youngest. Binyamin was the youngest. Why is Yosef the ben zikunim? What does it mean? Says the Ramban, it doesn't mean he's the youngest. What it means is he had a special status. It was a title. What's the title? Look here at source 11. Okay. V'hanireh be'enai ki minhag hazakenim sheikhu echad mibneihem haktanim liot imo l'sharso. What it happened to be during those days, what they used to have is an older father would pick one of his children to be the one who stays with him all the time in the home, to serve him, to help him. V'hu nishan al yodo tamid v'lo yifrad mimenu. He would stay home with the dad all the time. He would never separate from his dad. And who was this? V'hu nikralo ben zikunav ba'avur sheishatzal zikunav. And he got this special title, the ben zikunim. So here we see that Yosef is chosen for this special status, to stay with his father at all times and to never leave his father behind unless his father sends him on a specific message. The Malbim, picking up on this idea of the Ramban, puts it together with the fancy coat and says, well, that makes sense now why Yaakov gave Yosef a coat rather than giving it to the other brothers. This is why he gave him a ketone pasim. Ki yeter habanim shayu tamid basadeh. Everybody else is in the field. They don't need a fancy coat, right? They're out with the sheep. They're out shepherding. They'll get it dirty. They don't get a coat. Avahu she'amad bebayit lifnei aviv. But he, Yosef, who gets to stay home with the dad, hayat sarich levosh big day kavod lekavod aviv. He needed special clothes because to honor his father, as he sits with his father all day long, he gets to, of course, wear these special clothes. So here we understand he's favored very, very clearly in front of his brothers. He has a special job. He has a special garment that he wears that shows his special status. We know he wears it out to the field that day when he goes to check on them. Yosef is very, very clearly favored by his father, which is why I'm going to flip right back up. I went down. Back up, right at the end of the psukim, Vayiru achav ki oto ahava bihem mikol banav. The brothers recognize this. The brothers see the favoritism. This is not something that's hidden. This is not something that isn't known. The brothers all know that Yosef is the favorite child. So on the one hand, we take a step back and we question Yaakov. What are you doing? Why are you favoring him? This doesn't seem to make sense. You know you're setting him up for a problem in the future. You know you're setting up your family for fighting. What are you doing? But if we take a step back, I think through Yaakov, we could really understand what's going on here and therefore apply this to all the other stories of favoritism. I'd like to present two approaches that I think are true in all the stories. Some have one, some have the other, but it's certainly true in this story. There are two reasons behind favoritism within the stories of Bereshit. One that I would call the human approach, human nature, the humanistic approach. And the other one would be the more spiritual approach, the more elevated approach. Let me explain what I mean. When it comes to Yaakov and Yosef, if I want to go from the human level, we have to understand that picking favorites is human nature. Think about how many of you have asked your children, or your grandchildren, what's your favorite color? What's your favorite teacher? Who's your favorite teacher? What's your favorite subject? You know, we always train our children for some reason to pick favorites. Pick what is your best. What is your best? We always ask people those types of questions. And then, of course, as you grow up, you always are picking favorites. You're picking your favorite friends that you want to hang out with. And it doesn't have to be negative. It could, it's cliquey, or you can make it positive. It's your chevra. It's the people you hang out with. We always pick favorites, right, within our lifetime. And why do we pick the friends that we have? Why do we hang with the people that we have? It's not a negative. We pick our friends because we have history with them and we have a relationship with them. We bond with them. We have things that are in common. And therefore, if I look at the Yaakov and Yosef relationship from that perspective, it actually makes a tremendous amount of sense. Yaakov loves Yosef more than the other brothers for a lot of very human reasons that make sense. What do I mean by that? What does Yosef represent to Yaakov? He represents his mom, Rachel. And we all know that Yaakov loved Rachel more than Leah. He wanted to marry Rachel. He did not want to marry Leah, ends up marrying Leah, and then works another 7 years for Rachel. So clearly he really wanted to marry Rachel. And if you look here at source 12, the language that is used by Yaakov in his relationship to Rachel, Vayahav Yaakov et Rachel, is parallel to the language we just saw, Yisrael ahav et Yosef. He loves Rachel and he loves Yosef from the rest of his sons. Why? Because he's the child of Rachel. We'll come to Binyamin in a little bit. But he loves Yosef because he represents for him Rachel. If you see when she's alive, here, if I flip to source 13, when she's alive, he, of course, favors Yosef because he favors Rachel. This is the story where they meet up with Esav. And when they're meeting up with Esav, he wants to make sure that his most beloved family members are the most protected. So what does he do? He puts Yosef and Rachel all the way at the end.
You want to attend this class, Mom?
Let's mute, please, ourselves, whoever that is. Thank you. Right, to make sure that Yosef and Rachel are the most protected. He loves Rachel, and therefore he also loves Yosef and favors Yosef. But when Rachel dies, you could understand that all that love that he had for Rachel really transfers over to Yosef and transfers over to her children, because he's lost his beloved wife, and what does he have left? They're her children. And if you look at source 14, I don't think it's by accident that it's possible even when he looked at Yosef, he saw Rachel. If you look at the language that describes Rachel's beauty, her physical attributes, it's Yifat Toar v'Yifat Mareh, right? It's describing her beauty. Look at the language that describes the beauty of Yosef. It's the same language, just in masculine. Yifet Toar v'Yifet Mareh. You kind of wonder if he looked like her, right? He had her beauty, right? That's what he looked like. So every time Yaakov looked at Yosef, what did he see? He saw his wife Rachel. And of course he was going to treat him different than he treated the other sons. The other sons represented Leah. This son represents, of course, Rachel, the Rachel that he lost, the Rachel that he loved so much. But besides the fact that Yosef represents his mother, and I would even say Yosef probably clings to Yaakov more than the other brothers because he doesn't have it. Binyamin's a baby. He doesn't have other brothers, and he doesn't have a mother. So therefore, he clings to his father. This relationship is very natural. It makes a lot of sense. But not only that, I could also understand why his father likes Yosef based on Yosef's personality. We see two personalities in Yosef, the one he has with his brothers, but the one that he has with other people. If you look at source 15, I gave you 3 different quotes of Yosef in terms of how other people perceive him. When he comes to the house of Potiphar, he's automatically favored. There's a charm to Yosef. There's a likability to Yosef. Vayimsa Yosef chen be'einav, Potiphar likes him and puts everything in Yosef's, power. Yosef gets everything. Vayazov, it's called Biyad Yosef. Yosef's in charge of his whole household. He seems to be very responsible. He's someone that people like and someone that people trust. Same thing happens again when he gets down to jail. The person in charge of jail likes him. There's something kind about Yosef. There's something charming about Yosef. And again, Paro, after he says his dreams, Ein navon v'chacham kemocha. There's no one as wise as Yosef. They see something in him that's mature. They see something in him that's charming. I would like Yosef Yaakov saw. He saw a boy that he just couldn't help but be in love with, just like Potiphar, just like Paro. He was this incredible child. The Kli Yakar picks up on this and says, what's another way to understand Ben Zikunim? Maybe it's not the way the Ramban and the Malbim said, but rather he was a mature child. He was Ki'ilu, like he was an older person. He says as follows, Mikol Makom Ahivo Yaakov. Why did Yaakov love him so much? Levi shehayoto etzlo hayam mitznaheg et atzmo kezakein v'ragil v'parko na'eh. When he was around Yaakov, he was this mature, older, wonderful child who was just such an incredible person. V'lo yadahin haguto shemachav. He didn't know how Yosef acted around his brothers. That might have been a little more immature and not as kind. Al Kena Marki Ben Zikunim Hulo. That's why we say the word Ben Zikunim. He was a guy who was like Ki'ilu, like he was older. He was so incredibly mature. This is what Yaakov saw. So how can you blame Yaakov for loving him so much? I gave you here in source 16 and 17, language of Yosef really parallels us so much to language by Esther. First of all, she has the same description, Yifat Toar v'Tovat Mareh, but not only that, the same description within her personality. She's Nosei Chen beinei kol ra'eha v'tisa chen v'chesed lefanav. And then what does she get? She gets chosen to be the queen. Just like Yosef, because of his charming personality, becomes second in control of Mitzrayim and the head of Potiphar's household, so too Esther gets chosen for that same personality, which would again not surprise us that Yaakov recognized something in Yosef that was incredibly special, which is why he treated him different than everyone else. Rashi points out another reason, even though he quotes some of the ones I just said here in source 18 because of Rachel, but also V'chol ma she'ira li Yaakov ira li Yosef. They had a lot in common. Sometimes you pick people as the people you want to talk to and hang out with the most because they get you, because you have so much in common. And Rashi and others list all these different commonalities between Yaakov and Yosef. They both had mothers who struggled to have children for a long time. They both end up having only 2 sons to that mother. They both have older brothers who don't like them so much. At the end of the story, of course, both of their older brother or brothers, tried to kill them and they have to run away. They have a lot in common. So here you could understand, Yaakov, who sees himself in Yosef, loves Yosef and everything he represents, and says, I was the unfavored child of my father. So I'm going to fix that for Yosef by favoring him, showering him with favoritism. And even if we maybe don't like it, I get it. I totally understand why Yosef is different than the rest of his brothers in the eyes of his father. And if we also take a step back further, we have to remember that especially in those days when they had many wives and therefore many sons, there was always going to be favorites, not just within the children, but also within the wives. If you think about it, source 19, Yaakov certainly favored Rachel over Leah. There's no question. It says it directly here in the pasuk. Vayav gamet Rachel me Leah. He loved Rachel more than Leah, right? And Leah feels so hated. It says it over and over. We also have similar stories with Abraham. He chooses Sarah over Hagar and sends Hagar away. We have that with Hannah and Penina, right? Elkanah, which is Shmuel's parents, right? He loves Kiat Hannah Ahab. He loved Hannah more than he loved Penina. We have David chooses Bathsheba over all of his other wives. There's a common theme where we have this idea that if there's many, many children and many, many wives, you have to choose the favorite. And therefore, from one perspective, I could just say from the human approach, I understand it. I may not like it. I may see repercussions for it in the life of Yosef, but I get why out of all the sons, Yaakov would choose Yosef to be that favorite child. But I want to add another layer, because when it comes to Yosef, it's not just the human element, but as I said to you before, it's also the spiritual element or the more elevated approach type element, which is in the life of Yaakov, he knew that he was forming this chosen nation. Abraham passed this down to Yitzchak, Yitzchak passed it to Yaakov. Yaakov knew he was passing it down. At this point in the story, one can easily argue that Yaakov didn't know how many children he was passing this down to, whether he was picking one to lead the rest, or he was just picking one to be part of this storyline of Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and who's next. Says the Malbim, that's exactly what Yaakov thought. He thought he had to pick one. V'hu, if you look here at source 20, v'hu ki adata rak echad min habanim haya halev haskula, v'yeter habanim hayu aklipot. Until now, one is always chosen, and the rest are kind of the shells that get thrown away. And he goes through it. Yishmael is thrown out because of Yitzchak. Esav is thrown out because of Yaakov. Yitzchak and Yaakov are the ones who are chosen for the bracha, and the other ones are kind of thrown out. And therefore he concludes, Basher lo yadu hashvatim shata yitznotzeta yinyan eloki amata shlema v'shekol shifteka yiyu leviskula. They didn't know all of them were going to be chosen at this point. They thought only one. And if they thought only one, I kind of get that Yaakov said, hey, I'm looking through my kids, and who's the one I see the most potential with at this point in the story? We know later he chooses Yehuda, but which is the one? It's Yosef. And therefore, if I look back at some of the psukim I said before, within this approach, it makes total sense. Eila Toldos Yaakov Yosef has a whole new meaning, because if I look at other Eila Toldos, like Eila Toldos Yitzchak here in source 21, it doesn't make any sense. Eila told us Yitzchak ben Avram, Avram holidetz Yitzchak. It's very repetitive, right? Yitzchak is the child of Avram. Avram gave birth to Yitzchak. We know that. What's this pasuk? This pasuk is telling me Yitzchak is the chosen child, right? Which it tells us a few psukim before. Avram gives everything to Yitzchak. The children of Keturah, the child of Hagar, all rejected. Yitzchak is the chosen. Sometimes Eila Toldos is to pick the chosen. We have it later here, source 22, with Aaron and Moshe. Eila Toldos Aaron and Moshe. We look hard, only Aaron's children are mentioned, because Aaron's children become chosen as the Kohanim and not Moshe. Eila Toldos could mean who's chosen. And therefore, at this point in the story, Yaakov's picking who he thinks is the chosen child. And who does he believe is the chosen child? That's Yosef. And therefore, he gives him a special coat. Just like source 23, Aaron takes off his clothes and puts it on Elazar. Why Elazar? Because Elazar becomes the Kohen Gadol after he dies. He's the chosen child. Why Yonatan takes off his coat, source 24, and gives it to David? Because he's saying to David, you're the king, not me. You have to wear this coat. And a funny one, Eliyahu throws his coat on the floor, but gives it to Elisha, because Elisha takes over as the next leader of the prophets. Maybe what Yaakov is doing here is saying, I'm picking the chosen. And if he's picking the chosen one, then I'll be honest with you, it makes a lot of sense. He gives him a lot more attention. It makes a lot more sense. He gives him a lot more of his time, because if I'm trying to, yes, raise a family for sure, but I'm trying to create a chosen nation, and I think this is the guy who's going to make that nation, of course I want to put more into him. Of course I want to spend more time with him. This is the guy who's my legacy. This is the guy who's going to create the chosen nation. So now with these two models in mind, the human approach and the more elevated approach, I want to kind of look at other stories of favoritism and see how it plays out according to both these approaches. So I'm going to go backwards in time, and we're going to start from the first story, which is Abraham. Now, Abraham, we know, has two sons, and for most of his life, the two sons don't live in the house at the same time. But I certainly do see an interesting triangle between Avram, Yishmael, and Yitzchak. And I'd like to divide them between these two approaches. Yes, I believe that Abraham knows, because God tells him so. Ki b'Yitzchak yikra lecha zera. He knows that Yitzchak is the chosen child. But Abraham, from a human standpoint, has a very hard time letting go of Yishmael. He's got his human contact with him. He has his love for this older child. But on the other hand, he's informed that he's going to have a second child that's going to be chosen. And you see the struggle of Abraham of dealing with that issue. If you start here with me on source 26, we have, before he even knows he's having any child, he complains to Hashem, I don't know what's going on. You keep telling me I'm having this great chosen nation, but you have not, lo natata zera, I don't have a child, which is of course what God tells him, you're going to have a child, it's going to come from you. But they're like, so now what? What do we do? Source 27, Sarah says, marry Hagar, and maybe she will have a child, and that child will be the chosen child. It seems very clear that Avram and Sarah believed that the child that's going to be born to Hagar is the chosen child, is the child that's going to create this chosen nation. That's very, very clear. Now, Yishmael is born when Avraham, source 28, is 86 years old. And he is not told that there's going to be another child by the name of Yitzchak, who is actually the chosen child, until he is 99 years old, which means there is a series of 13 years that Avram believes really strongly that Yishmael is the chosen child. That's 13 years. that he sits with Yishmael and raises Yishmael with the belief that you are chosen. He probably tells him at night stories of this chosen nation he's going to create. He bonds with this child in a very, very strong way. He believes, and God has not told him any other reason to think otherwise, that this is the chosen child. And therefore, when God comes to him when he's 99 and says, by the way, you're going to have another child and he's the chosen one, you shouldn't be surprised that Avram's reaction is, on the one hand, joy, he laughs, but on the other hand, Pasuk Yudchet, God tells him it's going to be Sarah, it's going to be another child. He says, Lu Yishmael Yachya lefanecha. What do you mean? I have this other kid. I have Yishmael. What's going to be of him? I spent so much time with him. I raised him. I told him he was chosen. What's going on? And therefore, God has to say to him, don't worry, he'll be a great nation, but it's not him. He's not chosen. And then, it's like he sees it. Avram's not giving in. Avram's fighting. So God's like, enough. Conversation's over. And he leaves. And as the psukim continue, you feel the pain of Abraham. He therefore takes Yishmael bino, his son, and he gives him a bris milah, Yishmael bino, over and over again, Yishmael his son, because you're feeling Abraham, wait a minute, this is my son. This is the one that I thought was chosen. And therefore the issues that come about because of this and the struggle of Abraham from a human approach, I totally understand. Did you ever stop and question, why is it that after Abraham is told by God that Sarah is going to have a child, right? Which is huge. She's 90. He's going to be 100, right? She's going to have a child. Why doesn't he tell Sarah? Why doesn't he tell her? How does Sarah find out she's going to have a child? Because 3 malachim show up and then they tell Abraham a second time and she overhears, which means Abraham kept this a secret. Did he keep it a secret because he didn't want her to know? Did he keep it a secret because he was secretly upset, hoping it's Yishmael? I don't know. It's very strange. You'd think, right? As a wife, I think I'd be pretty mad if I knew such a big secret my husband is keeping from me. Avram doesn't tell his wife. And then, of course, when Sarah says it's enough, kick him out of the house, Yitzchak is chosen, you see the emotion in the psukim. Again, Avram knows Yitzchak is chosen, but he's struggling to let go of Yishmael. He's upset. I don't want to get rid of my son. And he only does because God says, right? You have to listen to Sarah. Yitzchak is the one who is chosen. But what's interesting to me is that you still continue to feel that pain of Abraham, and it's brought out within many midrashim. It's fascinating. The midrashim capture that pain of Abraham to let go of Yishmael, this child that he put so much love in, the child that he thought was chosen, because now he found out a different child is chosen. He had to let go, and Avram struggles with it. If you look here at source 31 in the Psukim, it's very interesting. This is the story of Akedat Yitzchak. And in that story, God says, take your son, es yachidcha, your only son, asher ahavta, the one that you love, which is very strange language. And then, of course, it's Yitzchak. What has so many words to say, take Yitzchak. Afterwards, when he doesn't sacrifice Yitzchak, it says that you didn't hold back from giving me bincha, your son, yachidcha, your only son. And you know what's left out? Asher ahavta, the one that you love. And the question is it because God knows deep down the one that he loves is really Ishmael? Is it that he had to give up on that love in order to possibly murder him? But those words are left out, which is really interesting. Rashi picks up on this weird language of the psukim, of how many descriptions we have of Yitzchak, and brings down this fascinating idea from Chazal, which shows the struggle of Abraham. Now we have to understand, by the time we get to the story of Akedat Yitzchak, which is in Perachaf Bet, Perachaf Aleph, we've thrown Yishmael out. Yishmael's not in the picture anymore, but yet Chazal keeps throwing him back in. If you look at Rashi, God says, take your son. So Avram says back to God, it's a fascinating conversation. Amar lo shnei banim yesh li. Which son are you talking about? I have 2 sons, God. Which sons do you want me to take? And you're saying to yourself, what do you mean? One you threw away. What are you talking about? I have 2 sons. So God says, Amar lo yachidcha, take your only son. So Avram answers, Amar lo yachid limo v'zeh yachid limo. Which one are you talking about, God? This one's the only one to his mother, and this is the only one to his mother. So God says, come on, Marlo, Asher Ahav, take the one you love. So Avram says back, what do you mean, God? Shnehem ani ohev. I love them both. Which is when God has to say, fine, take Yitzchak. That's who I'm talking about. And it's such an interesting idea that Avram would even think about Yishmael at this point in time, which is showing us he never let Yishmael go. And that's captured in the Midrash, which Rashi brings down, source 33, that to the Akedah, he brings 2 Na'arim. In the Pshat, it's 2 servants. But in the Midrash, who is it? It's Yishmael. He brings Yishmael. Somehow Yishmael has come back to Abraham. They've reunited, and Yishmael is back in the picture. And even if I don't think that that's Yishmael who's coming back to the Akedah, I want to show you 2 other midrashim that capture this feeling of Avram never letting go in his heart of his son Yishmael, even though he's not the chosen child, because that's the human emotion. You can't just tell yourself what to feel. I gave you a piece of this beautiful Yalkut Shimoni in source 34, which tells the story of how Avram used to visit Yishmael. And you see the conflict, because in order to visit him, he had to promise Sarah, don't worry, I'll be there really, really short. I won't even get off my camel, like it's a short visit. So clearly she didn't want him to visit, and he wanted to visit. And of course, in the story, he gets off the camel, and there's a whole story of them reuniting with each other, and it sounds like more than once Avram would go and visit. So you feel it within Chazal. Avram could not let go of his son, and ultimately you see it to the extent of the very famous midrash quoted also by Rashi here in source 5, that when Avram marries his third wife, Keturah, which again in the Pshat is Keturah, right? However, in Chazal, this is Hagar. He's reuniting with Hagar, bringing the family back together, bringing Yishmael back into his home, having Yishmael back again as his child. And where does that idea come from? In the Psukim, source 36, when Avram dies, who buries him? Yitzhak and Yishmael, his children. They're all back in his life, burying him together. So here's where you see these two approaches, and they kind of come at odds with each other. It is possible from a human level, Avram really could not let go of Yishmael. It could be he also loved Yitzchak. You don't have to love one versus the other. But you see the struggle of him to let go of Yishmael, even though from an elevated level, he's told Yitzchak is the chosen one, and therefore he has to act accordingly. I want to move on to the next story of favoritism, which is a pretty obvious story because the pasuk tells us so, which is, of course, Yitzchak. Oh, wow, that's a big mistake, which I can change because we're on the screen. Yitzchak favoring Esav versus Rivka, who favors Yaakov. And how do I know that? Source 37. Vayahav Yitzchak et Esav, kitzayid befiv, v'Rivka ohevet et Yaakov. The pasuk tells me clearly, Yitzchak loved Esav and Rivka loved Yaakov. Now, from a human level, I understand this very much, because if I look at the psukim of how they're described, Esav's an ish sadeh, so it's possible he hung out with his dad in the field. And Yaakov is Yoshevo Alim, hung out in the tent. So who did he hang out with? He probably hung out with his mom. They had what's in common, one with the dad, one with the mom, and therefore that is who they connected with on a strong human level. The Ramban even points out, if you look at the language kitzayid befiv, it teaches me that Esav, who was a hunter, used to go out and bring home the meat. And you know what? Yitzchak liked meat. Kol hayom yitavel echol tatzayid. So think about it. Esav would go out to the field, make his dad a beautiful meal. Probably then he sat down and ate it with his father. I'm sure he didn't just hand it to him. And the two of them sat and had steak all the time together. From a human level, I get that Yitzchak bonds with Esav. Not only that, the Midrash in Dvarim Rabbah points out how incredible Esav was with the mitzvah of Kibud Av. He was so good to his father. So how can I blame Yitzchak for favoring the child that seems to treat him so nicely? On the other hand, I can't blame Rivka either. Source 39. Probably again, Yaakov hung out with her the most inside the tent. We know it's a story of cooking soup. He probably learned it from his mom. But says Radak even more so. Why did she love Yaakov? Because he chose a nice profession, a good boy. He chose a profession, b'derech hachayim, a shepherd. It's really very tame. Nothing bad's going to happen to him. Esav's a hunter, b'derech hamavet. It was scary to her. She was upset that Esav would pick such a profession where he could die at any moment, and therefore she chose to favor one son over the other. Rav Hirsch brings down an interesting theory, which I ask you to read on your own as I'm explaining it outside because of time. But Rav Hirsch says maybe I could even argue it's an attraction of opposites. Yitzchak was such a quiet character, and therefore he saw in Esav, who is this kind of very outgoing hunter, he was like, wow, that's such an amazing person. And therefore he was attracted to that characteristic. And Rivka, who grew up in the house of Lavan, who was deceitful, who was evil, she therefore saw in Yaakov, this beautiful child, all the things that she hadn't gotten growing up. And therefore I could understand from a human level without question why Yitzchak might like Esav more than Yaakov, and why Rivka might like Yaakov more than Esav. It makes sense. Again, to act that way and to act upon it might not be right, and Rav Hirsch certainly critiques them, but on the other hand, I get it from a human level. But from the spiritual elevated level, I get it too, because it seems very clear that Yitzchak intended to bless Esav, right? He was. Whether he was going to give one blessing to Esav and one to Yaakov, or everything to Esav is unclear. from the psukim, but it certainly does seem that he thought he was the chosen child, which is very interesting. And yes, you might say, but that's obviously wrong. Well, maybe it was. We don't know how the story would have played out had he given them both different blessings, or maybe he was wrong, which is okay. Shmuel also almost picked the wrong person to be king. You know, people are human, they make mistakes, but it is possible to argue he did think that was the chosen son. And Rivka, on the other hand, as we discussed last night, she had the prophecy. She was told V'rav Yavod Sa'ir that the younger is the one who's going to be chosen, and therefore she acted accordingly. Once again, I could understand from the elevated perspective why one might have chosen each of the sons that they did. But favoritism within Breshit is also having to do with other families. It's not just the family of Abraham that has this issue. I think very clearly in the Psukim, Lavan favored Leah over Rachel. I think favoritism is just something very normal. How do I see that? Well, I see it in three different ways. Number one, Lavan ruins Rachel's life to marry Leah to Yaakov. There was no guarantee Yaakov was going to marry Rachel after he was married to Leah. It's very possible he would say, okay, I'm married, done. And now Rachel's life is completely ruined. And this was orchestrated by her father. Not only that, here in source 42, Rachel we know is the shepherd. And shepherd is not normally the job that's given to the favored person. It's normally given to the person who's kind of more the slave of the home or the non-favored person, which is why when Moshe runs away to Yitro's home, he's given this job. You want to live here? Okay, be the shepherd. When Yaakov runs away to Lavan's house, okay, fine, be the shepherd if you want to stay within the home. Says Chizkuni, why is Rachel the shepherd and not Leah? Because l'chlok kavod l'gdula. Lavan favored his older daughter, so therefore he gave the dirty job to his younger daughter. Also, we see it in source 43. When his trafim, his idols, or whatever those things are missing, whose tent does he really search? Rachel. The psukim go on and on how he was looking through her tent and searching. Why? Because he probably had a feeling, oh, that daughter that I wasn't nice to, the daughter that I never liked, she's probably the one who did this to me. And therefore, he went through her stuff much more thoroughly. And therefore, if I take a step back, I still hear an echo, I kind of get the Yaakov and Rachel relationship. Them were the unfavored child of their own father, right? Yaakov is the not favored by Yitzchak. Rachel is the not favored by Lavan. They probably bonded really strongly over that scenario. And then, of course, their children, their joint children, became the favorites. It's such an interesting storyline, which I understand from a human perspective. There's no elevated perspective to the Lavan story. He had no idea his children were going to be chosen to be the imahot. And with that, I want to return back to Yaakov, because Yaakov has two more stories of favoritism. One is, of course, Binyamin. And this is, of course, the story of Binyamin after Yosef is sold, where it seems very obvious why Binyamin would be the favorite. He is now the only son left. So he's representing Rachel and all the love that Yaakov had for Rachel. And he's representing all the love he had for Yosef, because Yosef is now gone. Everything is put into Binyamin. And this is captured in the speech of Yehuda, source 44, about when he's talking about this young son at home. First of all, he's now the Yeled Zikunim. He took over the role of Yosef, right? And this other brother is dead. Vayivater hu levado. Binyamin is the only one left, li'imo, to his mom. Ve'aviv ha'hava. And because of that, he represents his dead brother. He represents his dead mother. Our dad loves him. And when Yehuda says it, he says it matter-of-factly. It's not with jealousy. It's not with judgment. It's factual. It makes sense. This is what he represents to our father. Of course, he's going to be the favorite. And it's not because he's the chosen child. Yaakov does not give him the biggest bracha at the end. He gets a small bracha. He ends up with the Beit HaMikdash in his property, which is certainly interesting. But it's not because he thinks he has more potential than anyone else. But it's from a human level. This child, of course, he's got nobody. He's got no brother. He's got no mother. All he's got is Yaakov, and he represents everything to Yaakov. Of course, Yaakov is going to favor him, and we really shouldn't. And I don't think the brothers, that's why they don't feel hatred towards Binyamin. They protect Binyamin. They don't feel any jealousy because of it. It just makes sense. His father should feel that way. But then there's the final story of favoritism when it comes to Yaakov, and it's coming up in this week's Parsha. And it's such an interesting story here in source 45. This is the story of Yaakov giving a bracha to Yosef's two sons, Ephraim and Menashe. And as we know, Menashe's older, Ephraim is the younger. But what Yaakov does is he gives the greater blessing by putting his right hand on Ephraim's head instead of on Menashe's head. And if you look at the psukim, the same language, Yosef gets upset. Wait, Dad, no, remember what happened to me when you favored me? Don't do this. And he begs his father, Vayomer Yosef Alaviv, Lo Kenavi, no, please, my father, don't do this. Please, I beg you, don't do to my children what was done to me. And Yaakov turns back with all that emotion too and says, I can't help it. I can't, because yes, from an emotion, from a human perspective, I get you don't want me to show favoritism, but from the elevated approach, from choosing who's more significant in the future, well, I'm really sorry, but your younger son is more significant. There's nothing I could do. Ephraim is going to be greater than Menashe, so I have to put my right hand on him. And Yaakov's right. Ephraim is greater than Menashe. From Ephraim comes Yehoshua. From Ephraim comes Devorah. From Ephraim comes Yeravam and Malchus Yisrael. However, from Menashe, we get smaller leaders. Gidon, Yiftach, Yair, smaller of the judges that we have. So he's right. Ephraim is greater. But also Yosef's right, because he's saying, you know what, Dad, this causes problems in the future. And you know what, that's also true. Because if you go to Sefer Shoftim, the book of Judges, so we have the leadership of Yoshua and Sefer Yoshua, that's Ephraim. We have Devorah from Ephraim, right? We have a lot of Ephraim characters. And then all of a sudden we have Menashe characters. We have Gidon and Yair and Yiftach. You know what happens when Menashe starts to take over leadership from Ephraim? A civil war. A civil war between Ephraim and Menashe happens during the time of Yiftach. They go at battle with each other. The jealousies of the Yosef children come out in that story. Yosef's right. Favoritism causes jealousy and causes fights. But Yaakov is also right, because one is greater than the other. And the Nachshoni actually, in source 46, asks this question, which is, come on, Yaakov, why'd you set up for failure once again? And so beautifully, the Nachshoni writes, no, this time Yaakov was smarter. This time he knew better. It actually wasn't his fault. Things got messed up. Because says the Nachshoni, what actually happened, and you can read it inside, is that he could have flipped Ephraim and Menashe. He should have said, Ephraim, you stand here, Menashe, you stand here, and make it obvious that he was given the bigger bracha to Ephraim and Menashe. What did he do instead? He told Ephraim and Menashe to look down. And then when they weren't looking at him, he went like this. Well, you know what? From their perspective, there was no way for them to know that their grandfather wasn't going like this, but rather was going like this. Had Yosef kept his mouth shut, they wouldn't have known the difference. It's because Yosef said, no, Dad, you put the hand on the wrong one, that made it obvious that Yaakov was favoring one over the other. But says the Nachshoni, had he kept quiet, Yaakov in his wisdom was giving Ephraim the bigger blessing without it having to be that Ephraim would know and Menashe would know. So when you go through all these stories, you see favoritism in every single one of the stories. You see it, but you understand it. You understand it from the human level. You understand it to some of the stories from the elevated level. If I'm picking who in the future is going to be the leader over the rest, and therefore I have to give the bigger bracha. I have to give more of my attention to that person versus the other. But before we can really understand all of this and put it together, we certainly see the complication of it. I want to do one more story with you. And this is the story that's kind of the reverse of the other stories, because instead of it being a story of choosing one son over the rest as the favorite, I want to talk about a story where one is chosen above, but as the least favorite, the one that is treated terribly as opposed to the rest of his brothers. And that's, of course, the story of David HaMelech. David HaMelech is not favored by his father in any way, and it seems very clear in the Psukim. If you go to source 47 with me, it's one of the weirdest stories. Shmuel HaNavi comes to the house of Yishai and says, one of your sons is the chosen son to be the king of the Jewish people. So now if you're Yishai, you line up every child, you might even line up some cousins, you line them up because you're like, hey, one of my people is going to be king. And comes Yishai and he lines up his 7 sons, not including David, until the fact that Shmuel turns to Yishai here in source 47 and says, what's going on? Lo bachar Hashem be'elah. None of these guys are chosen. What are you doing, Yishai? I mean, come on. And he has to say, Vayomer Shmuel Yishai, Hatamu anarim? you really, are you out of kids? Like, until finally it's just like, oh, right. Yeah, I do have another one. And he's out in the field. What a weird conversation. Why would you not bring David to be a choice? Why is he out in the field, not meet, even if, let's say, you don't think he deserves to be king? Shouldn't you bring him to meet the prophet? I mean, what an opportunity, right? To meet the Gadol Hador, the leader of that generation. You leave him in the backyard, out with the sheep. Again, the sheep, which was, as we discussed, is the dirty job. And then, of course, Shmuel says, please bring him. And of course, he's the one that's chosen. It's very strange. But the story gets even stranger. David is now chosen to be the king. So you're chosen to be the king. You think your status should get elevated. You should be treated differently. Source 48, when Shaul wants David to come to his home to play the harp for him, where's David? David's back in the zone. He's back out being the shepherd, the servant to his dad. Really? You have 7 sons. Pick a different son to shepherd your sheep. You just found out this guy is the king of the Jewish people. But Yishai treats him the same as he treated him before, back out with the sheep. So now he works for David, and he works for Shaul, and he travels between the palace where he plays for Shaul and his father's house. And when he goes back to his father's house, do you know what he gets to do once again? Here it is in Paragid Zion. He goes back home. He goes back to be the shepherd once again. He goes back to being treated just as badly as before. And not only that, even stranger here in source 49, there's a war that's taking place. Goliath, the giant, the big scary giant, is threatening the Jewish people. The story goes that Yishai's 3 older sons are out in the battlefield, and Yishai feels bad. He wants to send them some food. He wants to send them a care package, right? He wants to make sure they're okay. He's got 4 more sons other than David. Who does he send to the battlefield? Who does he send to danger to go bring the food package to his sons? He sends David. Here in source 49 says to David, go bring this to your brothers. Really? The one who was chosen to be king of Am Yisrael, you're sending out to the battlefield? It works out to our favor because he ends up killing Goliath. But from Yishai's perspective, that's a very strange thing to do. Clearly his father did not think so highly of him, to the extent that when he starts to build a relationship with Shaul, the comparison of his relationship to his own father Yishai to that of Shaul is really quite striking. Here in source 50, the pasuk tells us about the relationship of David and Shaul. It's love. I mean, they love each other tremendously. And even when Shaul starts to chase David down, throw spears at him, and treats him terribly, look what David calls Shaul. He calls out to him when Shaul is chasing him, and he calls him Avi. He calls him my father. You see, he's kind of replaced Yishai with Shaul when Shaul is treating him so badly. So you have to ask the question, and through these 2 answers, I'm going to come to my conclusion here, which is, why did Yishai treat David so badly? Why is it that he seemed to dislike him so much? And there's 2 different midrashim that capture 2 different answers that kind of bring everything together. If you look at with me, source 51, the Yalkut HaMechiri writes as follows. So he says there's 2 opinions. One says David was loved, and the second view, which is the one we're about to read, he was hated. Why? Well, here's the story, and it's going to take us right back to Yaakov. Yishai perish me'ishto shlosha shanim. He had a wife, right? The wife that he had his 7 sons with, and I know something went wrong with them, so he separated from her already for 3 years. Lachar shlosh shanim, after 3 years, hayalo shifcha na'ev v'nitzavela. He had a maid servant who was working in the house. She was very pretty, and he wanted to be with her instead. Amarla biti, so he says to the maid, my daughter, which is again just a form of niceties, Titkani atzmecha laila, get yourself ready tonight. Kadesha technasi alai beget shechor. We're going to be together, right? We're going to have relations, and I will free you. You will no longer be my servant. Now the shifcha, who could have been very excited about this, right? She actually feels very loyal to her mistress. So she runs to the wife of Yishai and says, oh no, save yourself, and the soul of my master, meaning Yishai, from Gehenna. So the wife says back to her, Matan, what's going on? So she tells her the whole story. This is what Yishai told me to do. What do you want? What can I do? Husband's been away from me for 3 years. He hasn't touched me. There's nothing I could do. Amrala, okay, here's my plan. She came up with a plan. Go get yourself ready. I'm going to get myself ready too. And that's what she did. The Eved goes in, the servant, the maid goes into the room with Yishai all ready to be with him, and then goes to by the door and shuts off the candle so it's dark. But she goes to close the door. She slips out the door and the mistress comes in, right? Here's a Rachel, Leah type story. He thinks he's being with one woman, but he's really with the other. So he's with his own wife that night. He doesn't realize it. And of course, who is conceived that night? David. Because he loved this mate so much. David looked different. Or you could just say, he had a different complexion. He had a different look to him. He was red, right? He had red complexion versus the brothers. So therefore, when the wife has died, right, and Yishai is saying, I wasn't with you. What's going on? What did they come to the assumption? That David was somebody else's son, right? She had cheated on him and it wasn't his. And therefore, Bikshu Banelo Hargav, that's Benah David. So the sons, the other 7 sons are like, let's kill him, right? Let's kill David. Now, Yishai is a nice man. So he says, let's not kill David. Kevan Shereushu Adom, Amarli Yishai sees a different complexion. He's like, clearly he has a different father, right? So Yishai says, no, Anichalo, let's leave him. We'll make him our slave. And that's why David's always out in the field, because his dad didn't think he was his. He thought he was another man's child. And that's why he treated him the way he did, making him be the shepherd. When does he find out that this is his child? Says the Midrash, that day that Shmuel comes. When Shmuel says, do you have another kid? And Yishai's like, maybe I do. Maybe it's David. And he brings in David. That's when he finds out David is his son. One answer, why did he treat David so badly? He didn't think David was his son. Second, Midrash, here source 52, his father did not like him. Why? When David was a little boy, he used to prophesy, but obviously Yishai did not know this was prophecy. So he used to go around the house saying, in the future, I'm going to destroy the Plishtim. And I'm going to kill this giant by the name of Goliath. In the future, I'm going to build the Beit HaMikdash. So his dad's like, oh my gosh, this guy's crazy. Why does he think he's going to be so amazing? What did his dad do, as Yishai do? I need to humble you. I'm going to put you outside with the sheep. Now, these 2 answers of the Midrash as to why Yishai didn't like David actually gives me 2 very different approaches to all of these stories. You see, answer number 1 is that it is true that favoritism is not good. It doesn't lead to good results. But it is also true, as we've tried to prove, that very often it's a natural result of our lives. It's a natural result of situation. There are reasons why sometimes one is favored over the other, or one is not favored over the other. In the case of David, his father did not believe he was his child. So therefore, he treated him differently. In the case of Yaakov, Yosef had a different situation. He had a different mom, and then his mom died. And if you think about it, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, they all rebel against their father in different stories. So of course they're going to have a different relationship when their father. There's no way they can all have the same relationship. They have different encounters with each other. Different things have happened in their lives that cause their relationship to be different. But in the second medrash, I think it actually takes a different perspective, which is sometimes what we think is favoritism is not favoritism, but rather it's just good parenting. You can't treat all your children the same because they're not the same. First of all, one's a boy and one's a girl. You can't treat them the same. If you buy them the same pink bow, the boy is not going to appreciate it, just to be very simplistic. But they're all different from each other, which is why you have to treat them differently. Yishai may have felt David needed to be humbled. He may be wrong because he didn't know his nevuah, but therefore he felt he needed to treat David different than the other children because he believed that was good parenting. And therefore there are times where we view things as favoritism, but really all it is that parents treat and grandparents treat children differently because again, they are different. And therefore good parenting is actually to treat them different. But here's the irony. The irony is that even though throughout all these stories, we have the favorite and the non-favorite, in every single one of these stories, it's actually the not favorite that ends up being chosen. You know, in the story of Yishmael and Yitzhak, even though I think Avram's heart really belonged to Yishmael, Yitzhak, of course, is the chosen. You know, Yitzhak obviously favored Esav, but Yaakov becomes the chosen. Yaakov favored Yosef tremendously and Binyamin, but Yehuda ends up being the chosen for leadership. And as we just said, David, who is the non-favorite, he is, of course, chosen to be David Melech Yisrael Chai V'Kayim. So it's an interesting message that's coming through the psukim. One, favoritism is a natural thing. Favoritism is just part of human nature. Favoritism could have bad results, but that is how it is. Sometimes favoritism is the right thing because, again, if you think one son is chosen over the others, especially in the times of Bereshit where they had to pick one over the other, it made sense to treat them that way. But there's also this message of favoritism shouldn't get us down because even if we feel unfavored by our bosses, by our parents, by anyone, right? By friends, what it shows in Tanakh is that how other people view us and how they treat us doesn't determine our goal in life and doesn't determine what's going to be for us in life. Because all of the non-favored are the ones that actually succeed at the very end. All of the non-favored are the ones that end up being chosen, end up being the ones who make the greatest effect. And therefore, I want to end with this following, and it's not on the source I sent because I just added it like 10 minutes before this year. I wanted to close with this quote from Sachs. Since he passed, I've been reading all his books and finding such treasures in them. But Sachs discusses this issue. He discusses this issue in terms of favoritism, in terms of sibling rivalry, all things that are themes in Breshit. And he says a beautiful message at the end, which is we may see favoritism in our lives and we may see sibling rivalries and competitions and jealousies, but at the end of the day, God loves and chooses all of us. And therefore, none of it is really meaningful because who we are and who we become is really all based on what God believes in us. And therefore, we're all on equal footing when it comes to God. If you look at source 53, with this, I will close. The Torah's unmistakable message is that sibling rivalry, and I could put in here favoritism, may be natural, but it is not the inevitable. It can be conquered. There is no need to want someone else's blessing. We each have our own. In the end, Genesis affirms the incommensurability of the human person. We're all different, but we each carry in our being the trace of the one God. God cares for all he creates. On the surface, Genesis is a series of stories in which the elder is supplanted by the younger. Beneath the surface, in a series of counter narratives, it tells the opposite story, subverting the whole frame of mind that says, either you or me, if you win, I lose, if I win, you lose. It is not true of divine love. God does not prove his love for some by hating others. Neither, if we follow him, may we. I think the conclusion of Rabbi Sachs, which is a beautiful way to end, is that certainly favoritism is there. Favoritism exists. Favoritism doesn't have to control us. It doesn't have to define us. And certainly in the eyes of God, we are all chosen by him, and there are no favorites in his eyes. And so too, we should try to view the world similar to God. I thank you all so much for these two different shiurim within 2 days. It's been really fun to sit and learn with you. I'm going to now stop share. And if anybody has any questions or comments, I invite you to please to ask, unmute. But thank you very much for inviting me. And thank you, Rabbi Yasker, Rabbi Green, and the sponsor. Thank you so much. Anyone?
Thank you, Dr. Price. Shkaya.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was wonderful.
Yes,
Thank you very much.
a
Dr.
lot
Price.
learned today, a lot
Everybody
learned.
has benefited much from your Torah.
Thank you.
Hey, Brenda.
Thank you so much. It was
Thank you,
fabulous.
Nechama.
Fabulous as always.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful.